forward. The honourable member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour to rise as the seconder of this private member's bill, C-234. In the debate about a previous government bill, C-4, government members often spoke about restoring balance to Canadian workplaces. And we in the NDP were happy to support that legislation because C-4 did restore balance to certification and decertification. But we need to be concerned not only about the right to join a union, but also about the right to bargain collectively. An essential component of balance in collective bargaining is that in the rare cases where this process breaks down, both sides bear a cost. Employers do without labor, while employees must do without their wages. That puts pressure on both sides to keep negotiating and to try to find a solution. The use of replacement workers, or scabs, destroys that balance by allowing the employer to continue functioning as though there is no labor dispute. We have had far too many cases in Canada of employers demanding severe concessions, locking out workers or provoking a strike, and then using scabs rather than negotiating in good faith. So one problem with replacement workers is that they can be used to prolong labor disputes. Another problem with replacement workers is that they increase the likelihood of violence. The process of moving scabs across a picket line into the workplace inevitably puts the employer's security forces in confrontation with the picketers. That's a recipe for bad things, Mr. Speaker. But even where replacement workers are not actually used, the implicit threat of scabs gives management an unfair advantage in bargaining. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's a very simple solution to all of these problems: to prohibit replacement workers during legal strikes and lockouts. And this is not a new or theoretical solution. 2 provinces already have anti-scab legislation. And I would suggest that the longevity of anti-scab legislation in those jurisdictions is a testament to its success and to its workability. Quebec has had anti-scab legislation for nearly 40 years. British Columbia has had anti-scab legislation for nearly a quarter century. In both of these provinces, anti-scab legislation was introduced by social democratic governments. But importantly, it has been continued by subsequent right-wing governments. So at the provincial level, parties of both the left and the right have accepted anti-scab legislation. Well, what about here at the federal level? What did we hear from the Liberal Party? Well, the member for Cape Breton-Canso tried to tell us that the existing provisions in the Canada Labour Code, which don't actually prohibit replacement workers, constitute some kind of appropriate balance. But I think I've already explained, Mr. Speaker, why the real balance involves pressure on both sides during a strike or a lockout. The real way to achieve balance is not to have replacement workers in the equation at all. I think the sense in which the member for Cape Breton-Canso considers this a balance is that you have 2 sides, unions and employers. And, unions obviously would like to have anti-scab legislation, and, employers wouldn't want to have it. And he doesn't think we can make a change without consensus. Well, that's kind of a disingenuous argument, Mr. Speaker, because the current situation confers a huge advantage to employers. So, of course, employers are never going to voluntarily agree to giving that up. It's for us, to parliamentarians, to actually make a balanced assessment, and that's exactly what this private member's bill proposes. Now, we've also heard the argument from the member for Cape Breton-Canso that this is the wrong process, that we don't want to just look at one little element of the Canada Labour Code. We need to do a big tripartite review of the whole thing. Well, I say, bring it on, Mr. Speaker. There hasn't been a review of the Canada Labour Code since 2006. The member for Cape Breton-Canso kept saying, we can't do this without a big review of the Canada Labour Code. Well, let's have that review of the Canada Labour Code. I think that would be very much welcomed on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. So that's not really a good argument not to adopt this legislation. Let's go ahead with the review. Now, I think the main argument, though, from the member for Cape Breton-Canso was this notion that it's somehow inappropriate to put forward this proposal as a private member's bill. And I guess leave it to the Liberal Party to turn a question of principle into kind of a question of process. Now, the grain of truth in this argument was the idea that the previous Conservative government did abuse private members' bills to make changes to labour legislation without the same sort of scrutiny that would have been applied to government legislation. So that's a criticism that you can make of a government. And if this government wanted to put forward, legislation to implement a ban on replacement workers, obviously we in the NDP would support that legislation. The reason we're putting it forward as a private member's bill is that the Liberal government hasn't put it forward on the order paper. They missed the opportunity to do so in C4. And the only way that we have to put forward legislation is a private member's bill. So we heard the statement from Cape Breton-Canso that this is introducing a change by the back door. It's not the back door, Mr. Speaker. It's the only door to which the NDP has access. So yes, from a process point of view, one could criticize a government for sneaking things through with a private member's bill. You can't criticize the third party for introducing legislation through a private member's bill because that's the only way it can happen. So what did we hear in this debate from the Conservative Party? Well, the member for Louis Saint Laurent, first of all, suggested that anti-scab legislation was inappropriate in the federal sector because the federal sector includes these strategic industries, these kind of essential services. Well, the way to protect essential services isn't to allow replacement workers. I mean, if you have specialized people in telecommunications off the job, and that's causing a national emergency, the solution isn't to bring in scabs. The solution is hopefully to negotiate some sort of essential service protocol with the union. And I mean, if that's not possible, there is the possibility of back-to-work legislation under the Canada Labour Code. Now, the member for Louis Saint Laurent said, well, we don't want to spend all our time in Parliament passing back-to-work legislation, which is kind of a funny statement, Mr. Speaker, because the Conservatives were content to spend all kinds of time doing that in the last Parliament when they were in power. Every major strike or lockout in the federal sector during the previous Conservative government attracted back-to-work legislation from that party. So I do believe that comment, is a little bit out of context. Now, one of the concerns that the member for Louis Saint Laurent raised was that anti-scab legislation could force employers to settle labor disputes quickly. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that that's a feature, not a bug of this private member's bill, that we actually want to bring these disputes to a quick resolution. And this is one of the problems with replacement workers is that they drag things out. And one of the benefits of this legislation is that it's going to speed things up. We also heard an argument from Louis Saint Laurent that there was more labor disputes in Quebec versus Ontario, and this is all the fault of anti-scab legislation. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd suggest there's a whole bunch of other differences between Quebec and Ontario, including a higher rate of unionization in Quebec. I think the better comparison is what happened within Quebec when anti-scab legislation was passed, because actually it was passed in response to an extremely high level of very disruptive labor disputes in that province, and the introduction of anti-scab legislation led to a great reduction in the number of strikes and the amount of picket line violence in Quebec. So I actually see this as a good model for the federal sector. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I urge members to support this private members' bill, which they're free to do because it is a private members' bill. They don't have to vote on party lines. This legislation would strengthen the right to strike while at the same time producing fewer, shorter, and less violent labour disputes. Thanks very much.
Resuming debate, the parliamentary secretary.